So, the last conversation was amazing, if I do say so myself. And I do. But I think that it kind of primed us for where we're going with this conversation, which is one that we at the Federation have been dealing with for a very, very long time. And so it is going to have a very similar structure to the prior panel. However, our remarks are probably going to be even more brief, because the purpose of this conversation is to really facilitate dialogue amongst you all. And this conversation is the racial equity definitions, from Black farmers to socially disadvantaged producers to an intersectional matrix framework. So that's a lot of words. And as you can imagine, we're talking about definitions in the Farm Bill. And I'm a lawyer, so it's super exciting for me to have that conversation, and for some of the other policy nerds in the space. And so we're going to make sure that we have some really passionate thought leaders to help edify you all with some ideas of what you can reflect on and share in this space. But this is a conversation that we anticipate could possibly bring up a variety of things, right? So we have invited guests, we have Federation Advocacy Institute members, we have Federation Advocacy Institute members who are also members of other organizations and coalitions. We're a member of several of the coalition partners that are in this space, and so there's a variety of perspectives on these definitions, and so we want to be mindful of that. And also, as was alluded to in the previous panel, you know, words matter. How folks are defined, how folks are named, how they're represented, that really has an impact on the experiences that they have within our food system. And so with that in mind and the possibilities of any kind of discomfort that could come up with that, we just want to be very mindful, which I don't want you to be too comfortable because you'll fall asleep after that big meal. But in addition to just your food digesting, there's already been a lot that you've all been digesting throughout the conversations that have already occurred. And so I want to invite Dr. Jazz up, who is with the National Black Food Justice Alliance, who will be one of our panelists. But we want to start this conversation. Once I remind you all of the ground rules one more time, we're going to have her come and give us an activity to kind of help us really be very present and focused and prepared, because discomfort will come. And this is a conversation where the likelihood of disagreement is high, and that's a part of the process. We're here to talk about solutions, and as we saw at the end of the last panel, there are no easy answers. You know, the colonizers, those who've created this illusion of white supremacy, they have really kind of been very intentional about the scale at which that was operating on an international level. And so we're the products of that system. So even the language that I'm speaking right now, right, is impacted by my own colonization. And so decolonizing ourselves from having that sense of, you know, urgency that has been imposed on us by the colonial institutions, it's gonna be an ongoing process. So because there's a tendency to have a disagreement, I just wanna remind us all again of the ground rules, and I'm gonna do a fast synopsis. This is, the ground rules are rooted in the term equity. So I think there were folks who had some question about why those letters were chosen, but it spells out equity if I wrote it out on the board. So E, everyone should participate fully. Q, question your assumptions. U, use our group time to solve problems. I statements only. T, truth with compassion. Y, yes and, not yes but. Okay, are we all still in agreement about those ground rules? Yes. Awesome, I love it. Anyone disagree? I'll take that as a no. Fantastic. All right. So Dr. Jazz, can you please, you can sit there. It's up to you. Whatever's more comfortable.
It is actually more comfortable. Can y'all hear me from here?
You have to press the.
Now can y'all hear me? All right, appreciate that. Peace, everybody. I'm Dr. Jazz with the National Black Food and Justice Alliance. And before we get into woo-hoo, I see some people in the room I know, and some that I want to know too. But before we get into it, I'd love to invite us for a deep breathing exercise. This is a little centering activity that Susuyu shared that we've learned throughout our times in embodiment. So each of these things, we're going to focus on 4 different directions: our length, our width, and our depth from the front and the back, and then we'll center in the middle. But when I read these things, I would like for you to take 2 deep breaths for each reading, okay? And this is something if you want to stand, feel free. If you want to keep sitting, feel free as well. So we can start with one collective inhale. And exhale. I remind you to think about your commitment while you're here. So first, we'll breathe along our vertical axis on our spine, wondering how you breathe and feel the breath growing from your roots. Feel rooted and feel the air travel up your spine and into your crown. One more deep breath in. I invite you to breathe into your width, the horizontal axis from left to right. Breathing along the width of your body and thinking about the community you're with and the connectedness. Think about who you're walking with in this journey. Now for the depth in the back. Breathe into the back of your body. And as you do, feel the support of your ancestors, the visionaries, the activists, your mentors, and even your past self, gathered all in support behind you. I invite you to deep breathe into the front of your body. And as you do, feel into what is pulling and calling us, what is in the future, and what's leading us down the path onward together. And finally, breathe it into your center. And as you do, return to that commitment. And as you open your eyes, you focus on that center spirit and the life force, and it comes up with a commitment. And whether this just for this meeting or for life or for anything, just be here and present with us with intention. You can take one more deep inhale. We'll exhale. Remember to come back to your breath in the times that you don't feel settled or that you're having lots of thoughts racing. Keep practicing your breath together. Thanks, y'all. All right.
That was fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you all for participating in that. I think that you always have the power of your breath. You can call upon it whenever you need to do so, and being reminded of that power is very, very helpful. So in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to summarize the history of socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers as used in the Farm Bill. So I really could go on and on because this term has a very storied history, and there are folks in this room that were actually in the room when this term was being used for the first time in the 1990 Farm Bill. And so I just want to honor that this brief history is not all-encompassing, and it is just for the purposes of grounding this conversation that we're entering into together. As many of you know, especially those of you who are involved in our work around the intervention, the history of the term socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers in the 1990 Farm Bill is partially the result of the congressional and USDA record of race-based discrimination against Black farmers and the resulting Pigford lawsuit filing class action settlement. And there were efforts that were happening for a very, very long time around addressing the needs of Black farmers in light of all of the very well documented and well-substantiated histories of racial inequities in access to credit, in particular from the USDA Farmers Home Administration and then later Farm Service Agency. So there was an initial conversation around having Black farmers be centered around equity within that 1990 Farm Bill. And through the process of the negotiations of the Farm Bill, that there were basically two outcomes, one of which was the use of the Small Business Administration's term, socially disadvantaged farmers and, well, socially disadvantaged businesses. And so that was adopted in lieu of Black farmers as a term that would reflect those folks who had been historically disadvantaged through the institutions. And so that term was used, and there was also the establishment of the 2501 program, which many folks misunderstood as a program that provided resources directly to farmers and ranchers of color. Instead, it is actually a technical assistance program that is given to nonprofit organizations who work directly with those groups. So there's already one level of removal from the reality of what laid the foundation for that legislation to be passed. And we have to really think critically about the way in which that terminology has now turned into something that is vulnerable of being overturned in the court system. And part of that rationale is that the documented record within Congress and the USDA, as far as discrimination goes, maps back to the ways in which we have thought historically about race in this country as a Black and white issue. So when you go from evaluating the differences or the racial disparities between Black farmers and white farmers, and then within the grouping of Black farmers, you include other groups of people that have different histories, from a legislative perspective, you've already added a layer of disjunction between how it's legislated and how it will be interpreted by the courts. So what I mean by that is by having an inclusive term that includes other groups that do not have the same congressional record, the same well-established documented history of race-based discrimination, that creates the circumstances by which groups, such as the one that challenged American Rescue Plan Section 1005, Emergency Debt Relief for Farmers and Ranchers of Color, were able to argue that their constitutional rights under the 14th Amendment, equal protection, were being violated by this debt relief program. So there were a lot of words in there, but basically when our laws are being written to address a racial harm, the government has to be very, very careful about the remedy. So it can't have too far of a reach on who it is giving that relief to. And one of the problems that we've seen historically with SDFR is that it has become more and more inclusive as a term as time has gone on. Different USDA agencies use different definitions of who exactly is socially disadvantaged. So you go from a definition that includes Native American farmers and ranchers, Black ranchers and farmers and ranchers, Latin folks specifically within racial groups, racial minority groups, and then you add to that gender, you add to that veteran status, you add to that, all of the add-ons of other groups that have historically experienced discrimination as well. Unfortunately, that record, which our courts make decisions based on, is not as expansive for those other communities. And now I just want to be very clear that that does not mean that these other groups did not have discrimination. What it means is that the way that the government was measuring discrimination was based on a Black-white paradigm. And so the inquiry, the investigation, the resulting data that was collected didn't substantiate those other groups' experiences as did the experiences of Black farmers. So there has been a movement of folks that are pushing back on the use of that term. And that is also a part of what we saw happen with the courts looking at that term, and whether or not it accurately captures the right folks. We had the sister from Kentucky, Tiffany, mention about how white women are benefiting from that term. It's a similar process for affirmative action where, you know, white women have been beneficiaries of programs because gender-based discrimination is a reality. And there are ways in which folks have gamed that system. So there are white men who might add their wife or their daughter to their business so that it can be classified as a woman-owned business. And those are the ways in which, without a very well-documented record on a particular group's experience, then the implementation of the solutions to bring equity become compromised.
Why, thank you, Dãnia. I'm not sure how I'm supposed to follow this brief, beautiful history, but brief, and I just learned a lot, even in that small moment. So thank you all for having me, and I'm going to talk about the Justice for Black Farmers Act. I know this is something that you all may already be familiar with, but leaning in from what Dãnia said, the definitions matter. So this Justice for Black Farmers Act, it actually was first introduced in 2020 and then reintroduced in January of this year, but it goes much back further than 2020. This legislation is a continuation of the full justice that has been sought under the original Pickford case, which was a class action lawsuit, as Dãnia just mentioned, of the racial discrimination from USDA and farm loans not assisting Black farmers. So the Pickford-Glickman lawsuit actually was expanded under the 2008 Farm Bill, and it provided additional funding for some claims and some related administrative costs, but it still did not get that crucial debt relief recovery or the land that was never enacted. So this Justice for Black Farmers Act, it's a continuation of that fight, but it's not just any legislation. So when I hear legislation, I always think about policymakers and people in Washington. But when I hear the Justice for Black Farmers Act, I think about Dara Cooper, our founding person of the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, as our former executive director, who worked on this legislation on her sabbatical with members of the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, along with Heal Food Alliance. And they met with Senator Booker's staff and Senator Warren's staff to draft this legislation and ensure that the needs for Black farmers was sourced directly in there. So it's been introduced. The act has created the Agriculture Equity Commission. Y'all know Mama Savvy Horn, a couple other people I'm sure you're aware of are on that commission. And that commission was brought because it wanted to lead into the historical studying of the discrimination that's still happening today and want to ensure that there's recommendation for treatment that stops that and actually remedies it. But the Equity Commission has gotten some feedback that when you name Blackness into legislation, there is a pushback against anti-Blackness. So as we just heard about the American Rescue Plan, and that was set to provide that relief for all farmers of color, but it seemed like Black farmers got identified and singled out and the legislation was stopped. So I want to name again that the purpose for this bill, it is to address the history of discrimination against Black farmers and ranchers. And it requires reforms for the USDA to prevent further discrimination. But it's important to know about this act, along with the community to know, and you're talking about it with people in your family, people in your kitchen, when you're at church, when you're making groceries. All these spaces need to be ingrained with this legislation because it's very monumental. The people deserve to know that there's legislation that will restore land that has been stolen with land grants to existing and beginning farmers of 160 acres each. It might not be their land to give, but it's ours to have. Legislation that will provide substantial resources to 1890 land grant institutions of $500 million or more for 10 years. And I'm hearing you, Tiffany, having those funds actually audited and ensuring that the money is getting to the people. People need to know that there's legislation that will provide technical assistance and increase access to capital for Black farmers. People need to know that there's legislation that will provide paid training opportunities for careers in agriculture. People need to know that there is legislation that will stop abusive practices in meat packing companies. And that's not just for Black farmers. That's for all farmers that are ensuring that we have food. legislation that exists that will provide pro bono legal assistance. Like, would we all have a Dãnia for succession planning to stop the heirs' property land loss and the unclear titles? There's legislation that exists that has this written into it. And also legislation that will create a new bank to fund these opportunities for farming co-ops and forgive that USDA debt that was wrongfully given to us from the Pickford legislation. But the people really deserve to know that there's legislation out there that will right the wrongs that's been done so long ago and the harms that are still happening today. So I know I'm personally fighting for the Market Bill, the Justice for Black Farmers Act, to be included. And it's not just for Black people, because when Black people win, we all win. And I want to kick it over to Susuyu because it's more of an intersectionality that we're thinking about as well with these definitions.
So, thank you, Dr. Jazz. Hi, everyone. So I'm Susuyu, and I'm with Soul Fire Farm, and I just want to, just in case you don't know, Soul Fire Farm, we're an Afro-Indigenous community and programmatic farm committed to uprooting racism and ceding sovereignty in our food system, and we are located on Mohican territory in so-called Grafton, New York. And I'm here to add to the robust discussion by talking about an intersectionality matrix and bring it back to the personhood, the embodiment, and that narrative kind of storytelling that we were talking about or have been talking about throughout the day. And so to begin, like, all of us embody a complex matrix of identities, including some that provide social advantage and some that limit access. These identities can include ethnicity, gender, race, ability, etc. Take me, for example. My name is Susuyu. I am a Black, genderqueer lesbian. I am Nigerian, living in the US on a student visa and working to support myself and my family. I have 2 degrees from university education, and I am poor. The disabilities I live with include neurodivergence and being hard of hearing. I am dark-skinned, and I am an elder sibling. I embody all of these social identities, and they all intersect to create my unique experience moving through this society. Some of these identities hold privilege, i.e. being college educated, while others limit access, i.e. being poor and on a non-immigrant visa. Like me, each of you has your own complex matrix of identities that inform your lived experience in this society. Some identities, as has been previously said, bestow privilege, and others are limiting. It's hardly any fault of ours, and is more so an indictment on the societies in which we live our lives. For those of us that are racialized within the context of this white supremacist society, this construct, we see how certain identities have been created and forced upon us to limit our ability to flourish on this land. Speaking specifically to the experiences of Black farmers, a group whose identity as racialized farmers has been historically used to limit our access to land, which we know to be the basis of all freedom and all that's possible on land. We understand the importance of naming these identities as we seek to rectify the harms that have been committed on their basis. Let me offer a story from Soul Fire Farm. In 2007, Leah, who is one of our founding co-directors, was denied a bank loan to build farm infrastructure. And while the bank told us that it was not race-based, it was hard not to notice that the white farmers in the county were getting loans from the same bank. Instead, we borrowed small amounts of money from a community savings group, similar to a Susu group where you organize and one person gets the money every month. And we protracted the amount of time needed to open the farm by working, saving, and spending. It took 4 years to build the first building on the land. We were also told that we did not qualify for most USDA programs because our soil was not agriculturally prime, yet it was the only soil we could afford. And shows how important credit and credit access is. I personally think that it's brazy to, for decades, deny Black farmers and growers access to land and credit based on our Blackness. And then when it comes time for debt relief and set-aside programs, refuse to name the demographics of people harmed by these racist policies and histories. Unfortunately, we see that that's exactly what is happening, as highlighted in my colleagues' sharing. And so we see now that we are in a liminal time when it comes to these definitions. Some of us want to hold on to the language of socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers because we do not want to see the existing USDA set-aside programs that name and address socially disadvantaged groups and histories to be in jeopardy. Others of us want to see our identities named. speaking directly to the experiences of Black farmers who are tired of being called anything but Black farmers in these policies, only to be left behind due to the ambiguities and descriptions that are used to address our experiences in the policy portion of things and also in the implementation. In this in-between time, might we consider definitions that take into account the complex matrix of our social identities when we're engaging with policymakers around and the USDA around debt relief and credit access? To jumpstart our visioning into this possibility, I invite you to ponder upon this question. What are the identities that you wear? They can include social identity categories such as race, gender, class, ability, etc., or they can be identities through which you best understand your lived experience, such as auntie, brother, sibling, caretaker, etc. And the question is, what identities do you wear? Please take some time to think about the question and jot some notes if anything comes to you.
So that was amazing. And what we're going to do now is, as Susuyu said, each of you is going to have just a few moments, just as long as the song that we have selected, to just reflect on the question. And hopefully, if you haven't already grabbed one of the pens and notepads on the center, now is a good time to do so. And so while the song is playing, you have a chance. And so you can just please remind them the question.
What identities do you wear?
It's talking about a revolution, Tracy Chapman. But I was gonna play it. I didn't know how to. The original one? By Tracy Chapman.
Don't you know, talking about a revolution, it sounds like a whisper while they're standing in the welfare lines, crying at the doorsteps of those armies of salvation, wasting time in the unemployment lines, sitting around waiting for a promotion. Don't you know, talking about a revolution, it sounds poor people gonna rise up, get their share. Poor people gonna rise up and take what's theirs. Don't you know you better run, 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 run. Oh, I said you better run, 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 run. 'Cause finally the tables are starting to turn, talking about a revolution. Yes, finally the tables are starting to turn, talking about a revolution. Oh no, talking about a revolution. Oh, while they're standing in the welfare lines, crying at the doorsteps of those armies of salvation, wasting time in the unemployment lines, sitting around waiting for a promotion. Don't you know, talking about a revolution sounds a whisper. And finally the tables are starting to turn, talking about a revolution. Yes, finally the tables are starting to turn, talking about a revolution. Oh no, talking about a revolution. Oh no, talking about a revolution. Oh no.
All right. Hi, everyone. Hello, hello. Can you hear me? Yay. Awesome. Well, we would like to open up space and invite any reflections or anything that is percolating for folks that you would like to bring to the larger group. And so please feel free to raise up your hand and share with us about your identities. Yeah. Yeah.
May I
If
speak?
someone- oh, yes, of course. Please. Sorry. Yeah, if you could please say your name, introduce yourself.
Yes.
For your sharing. Thank you.
My name is Lorette Picciano, and I am the executive director of the Rural Coalition based here in this area. And I thank you for a very good overview of this term, which for some reason life has made me live with for the past more than 40 years. And actually, to add to your history, there are actually two definitions of socially disadvantaged. And the first one was in the 1987 Ag Credit Act. And we were trying at that time very hard, and I was in the room with Ralph Page, with Greg Smitman of Intertribal Ag Council, doing the 1987 Agriculture Credit Act, which stopped 87,000 foreclosures around the country, but there was nothing on equity. And so we were looking for a definition of disparate impact. What was disparity? And the intention was, what is a definition of discrimination? And the only one that did exist at that point was in the Small Business Act. And so that's where we got it, because the lawyer said, where is your legislative history? And that was only by race and ethnicity. For some fortuitous reason in 1990, we added the same definition in section 2279A, and so it's twice in law. But then in 1994, when USDA reorganized, there was the Farmers Home Administration, as well as the Ag Conservation and Stabilization Service. The Farmers Home Administration split between Rural Development and Farm Service Agency, and Jill Long Thompson, who is a congresswoman from Indiana, decided to help us out and throw gender into the definition that was under the credit title. So now one of them included gender and one of them didn't. And I just want to put out as a note, one thing that we're going to have to just, well, then we wake up one day, you know, there's been opposition, but we wake up one day and Stephen Miller and Mark Meadows are going after this very definition and trying to take it to the Supreme Court. We all know, you know, after they, in their first job after serving as key whatever in the last administration, then you know, maybe we should take that as a compliment, because they see this as bad enough and interfering with what their vision is. But what we also know is the Farm Credit Administration, the Farm Credit Council, does not want us to collect any racial data when looking at the loans of the farm credit system, because they don't want to discriminate. And also, the crop insurance industry has not wanted there to be any racial definitions. Now, we know there's a lot of problems with all the data and how it's collected, and, you know, how this whole system works. And I think it's really important that in federal law we keep on making, you know, as in the, you know, the Black Farmer Justice Act and in other ways, to add more pieces. Sometimes it's a definition of a program, and so who can get into this program? Veterans are not included in the definition of socially disadvantaged. They were added as another group to the 2501 program, which was intended to support groups like the Federation and Intertribal Ag Council. And, you know, there's a whole long history. What I would say to kind of bring my thoughts to a close, and and as I said, I've been living with this for a really long time. You know, sometimes I wished we'd just written socially non-advantaged or something, and, you know, to bring it out. And then we can add all the other things. But, you know, we want to think about which things are looking at an affirmative view of what we wanted society, recognizing what we were trying to say is there's a disparity. And, you know, we don't want black farmer or tribal farmer to always mean a disparity. We want to look forward to a future where there's real equity. So how do we think about the transition? And one decision we have to make in this Farm Bill, you know, I have a memo that's like 20 pages long where one of our colleagues, you know, had a legal fellow go through and find all the places where this term is used. And it's all over federal law, you know, in the Sustains Act, which is a horrible piece of legislation that got stuck in the last budget bill. The Republicans actually use socially disadvantaged, and you know why? We don't really know, but we have to decide: do we keep those two definitions the same? I mean, do we keep, you know, leave the one with gender and the other one, or do we take gender out of the credit definition, which would also take gender as a basis for socially disadvantaged, set-asides, and so forth, out of all of the ag marketing service programs. And that's a decision that we have to make. It's not the only decision, but I just put that out on the table that we need to have really practical conversations because these definitions helped us get the lawsuit settled and so forth. So how do we do what we need to do in this Farm Bill and then think about the future? And thank you so much for listening. I think this has been a really important conversation.
I'd like for you all to expand upon the definition of equity. What do you really mean by equity? And I think she will talk about how we get there, but I'd just like for you all to talk to us about what you really mean about equity.
What does it mean to you?
Beg pardon?
What does it mean to you?
Well, I'm struggling with that. I'm struggling with it, and there's a whole continuum of you can put it on a scale of 1 to 100. You can put it on a scale of 1 to 10, and I guess I'm struggling with what that really means, and I know and until we understand what it means, we can't get there because we can't set goals until we fully understand and get on the same page of what we're talking about when we're trying to achieve equity.
Are folks wanting to respond to what equity, the definition of equity? Yeah, because 2 is that you want to add or respond, and then 1 is you want to change course.
Okay. From my understanding, equality is where the best I've seen this is like on a chart, but I'll do my best to explain it, or a diagram rather. Equality is where everyone's given the same thing. Equity is where everyone is given what they're needed to be on the same level playing field, correct? So one diagram that I saw that was super effective was 3 people standing outside of a football or a soccer game, and there's a fence, right? Okay, so I think we went over this last week at something. April was there. I don't know April, but I remember her. Okay, and so equality, in the equality diagram, there's this fence, and there's a father, maybe his teenage son, and the baby son, and they all get the same size box. Now the father is over the fence. The teenager can kind of see over the fence, but the little guy still can't see over the fence. Now, in equity, the father is given a small box, the teenager is given a slightly bigger box, and the little baby is given an even bigger box so that they can all see over the fence. And then in the issue of justice, when we're talking about justice, the fence is gone entirely. So that's real quick.
Thank you. My name is Badita Adib, and I'm with Ujama Farms and Ujama Seeds. I'd like to come at it a little bit different way. From the work I did in public schools, particularly in Maryland, we looked at the fact that some communities just didn't have what they needed to improve the schools. So if they were all given the same amount of money, it wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't fix the problem. So we moved toward language that we call adequacy. So what was adequate? What was needed in order to reach parity? And it wasn't going to be the same amount of money for everybody across the board. Now that actually passed through the Maryland General Assembly, and it's having tremendous impact on building school buildings, but it can't affect the heart, but it can affect where dollars go. So maybe there's some other language that we could try to apply. Did I take it sideways? I was on track? Okay. All right.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nina Ichikawa from the Berkeley Food Institute. This is such an important discussion. I just wanted to contribute part of my own family's experience being involved in Japanese American reparations movement. That's been a strong solidarity for HR 40 and African American reparations. And as you might know, we were put in American concentration camps partially from pressure from white farmers on the West Coast who wanted our farmland. And so they pressured USDA to take account of our farmland. They sent us to concentration camps for the duration of the war and immediately then seized the farmland so that it would not stay out of production, or USDA gave our farm equipment or our farmland to white farmers who were standing ready as soon as we left. So, we took about a 45-year struggle to get an apology and a mere $20,000 in reparations from the federal government that was given out race-based to specifically Japanese American families who were still surviving. They tried to wait as long as they could so as many people died as possible, but the few that were surviving got the apology and the $20,000 check. And it was, some people ripped up the check, threw it back in the people's face. Some people went to Vegas with it. People did whatever they want to do, put in college education fund. But, 1988, Ronald Reagan signed the apology and the reparations to Japanese Americans that were wrongfully imprisoned and many of whom lost their farms. So I just want to bring that up as, of course, a precedent for specificity. And I think that there have been too many white gatekeepers and middle people in this discussion who even are uncomfortable themselves with racial specificity. And we cannot let USDA off the hook with these vagaries that make ourselves confused. So there's there's past and there's future. So I'll wrap up in a second. But with regards to the past, I think racial remedies must be specific and for each group. Because there's no way you can lump it all in together. The history of Indigenous and African American, for example, how confusing to push it all together. Like I said, for us, and we've always been in strong support and solidarity for African American reparations, and we're part now of the California Reparations Task Force, part of the California state government, is we said reparations for Japanese American families who were in the camps. And they have lists. U.S. government is excellent keeping lists. So there's lists of everybody. It's not hard to find. So in the same way, there's lists of every single African American person who was enslaved and every single African American who was made to work for free. So you just give money to those people from the U.S. government who were enslaved. But taking it to the USDA example, there can be historical remedies for specific groups who were discriminated against. And then separately, future programs, it doesn't even need a complicated wordsmithing. Every American must get equal access to the same programs, and there must be lawsuits and imprisonment for USDA officials who violate that law. Why does it have to be more complicated than that? And my heart just breaks for all of the hardworking activists who are made to twist their mind in circles around something so complicated, or having to dance around people's feelings to make the words feel better. When we are Americans, they try to say that we're foreigners. We are Americans. We till this land. We pay taxes. We deserve, for the future going forward, full American access to all American programs.
I just wanted to contribute to the equity conversation and thinking about it. I think about equity, sir, as a process product, right? It's actually not a stagnant definition. And for me, it changes, it's really equity in context. It changes by place, it changes by gender, it changes by lived experience. So if we're talking about policy, I really think a process product where we're looking at a framework for equity versus defining it, like what are the minimum things we all think need to be included when a person is making a policy that we can agree on. You have looked at it through the maximum lens of equity for the time. Because if we go through another pandemic or something great, it changes the applicability of what we thought was equitable, right? So since the world is iterating and moving so quickly, for me, the best way is this is a process product.
Hello. Hi, my name is Isis Amusa, and I'm a communications contractor with the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, and also a research assistant with the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center. And so I wanted to clarify this discussion in the context of the Farm Bill and what is still relevant to us, because as we know, socially disadvantaged is still relevant to many programs that the USDA runs, but we know that in terms of federal legislation, we've now gone even lower to distressed borrowers based on the Inflation Reduction Act. And so considering that context, my expectation is that's the language or the bar that will be used for the Farm Bill, despite the fact that socially disadvantaged is still used for programs. And so my curiosity is that if we already know that socially disadvantaged is under attack in federal legislation, do we take the approach of just going all out and asking exactly what we want? Or is there some consideration to anticipating the pushback that we'll get for certain language and how that will stall the programs that our farmers need?
So I'm John Zippert. I'm an emeritus member of the staff of the Federation. I'm the chair of the Rural Coalition, and I was not in every meeting that Lorette spoke about in 87 and 90, but I was in a lot of those meetings. And, you know, the Federation at that point had put together something called the Minority Farmers' Rights Act. And we had in there a technical assistance program for community-based organizations and HBCUs, set-asides in all of the USDA programs, especially the conservation programs. We had a self-identifying minority farm registry to answer this question of who you could voluntarily identify yourself, even though we knew that they had records, they had coded all of their records by race. We came to socially disadvantaged because of the